My name is Victoria Voigt, and our today's guest is a founder of a very noble initiative, foundation called From the Depths, that preserves the memory of Holocaust victims and educates the next generations on how to build the future by understanding the past. It is my honor to introduce you, Jonny Daniels. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here today.
Let's start off from what studies say. A very comprehensive survey on Jewish identity claims that there are still several thousands Poles not knowing their Jewish backgrounds, mostly due to the post-World War II repercussions in this matter. How exactly is it important for them to ever get to know it, to ever get to know the full truth?
Well, I think that we have to look back from a historical perspective and understand, first of all, that pre-Second World War, the Polish Jewish community lived hand in hand. There was over 1,000 years of Jewish heritage and history here in Poland. And with that was a huge amount of connections between our two nations. And a huge amount of people who would marry Poles and Poles marrying Jews and all different kind of circumstance and situation. And as a result of that, a lot of people have, on one hand, a Jewish heritage. So you'll meet a lot of people here in Poland who had a Jewish grandparent or great-grandparent or whatever it may be. But in addition to that, you also have a really large amount of people who were hidden during the Second World War by Poles. We only know, according to Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Museum, of around about 6,500 Poles who risked their lives and the lives of their families to save Jews during the Second World War. However, there were so many more, and I personally know of many people whose parents or grandparents were hidden and no one came for them at the end of the war. Their families sadly were murdered in the German Nazi concentration camps, and therefore that heritage sort of remained with them, often as a secret. Sometimes these children didn't know, and only in later life they found out that they themselves were actually Jews who were hidden. And this does lead to a lot of questions being asked today, and I think it's incredibly important. All of us need to know where we came from. Knowing our roots and knowing who we are enables us to move forward. And I always encourage this. I personally am incredibly interested in my family heritage and history. And I know a lot of other people are as well. So I think the number of Jews here in Poland is a huge amount higher than the official numbers of a few thousand. There's probably tens of thousands, if not more, of people with either full Jewish heritage, mixed Jewish heritage, or whatever it may be.
It's exactly what the survey says. Is it possible that we don't want to know that? There obviously are people who prefer not to think about this past for whatever reason that may be. However, I think that there is a huge amount of interest, and you see a huge amount of interest in Jewish culture and Jewish heritage here in Poland. And I don't think from a perspective of a young person, I myself am 33 years old, so I don't see my generation and your generation particularly worried about finding out this. It's not anything to be scared of. It's a positive thing. And so I think that I don't see much fear in terms of finding this information out. What is the cultural significance of the Holocaust due to good storytelling?
What's the cultural significance? Look, I think that more and more today people are, there's a few different ways to look at this, right? Now, Holocaust survivors are passing away at an ever increasing rate, right? So you have this incredible generation of people who survived this tragic time who are passing away, and they're no longer with us. So the onus falls on our generation. Our generation has to stand up and tell their stories. This is why shows like yours are so important, because it gives this opportunity to learn from this past and make sure these stories are told and continued. This for me is one of the main reasons of the work that I do at my foundation. One of the most important projects that we have is filming and documenting righteous amongst the nations, Poles who risked their life to save Jews, but also Holocaust survivors, and especially people who'd never given a testimony before.
Why there is still so much of misinterpretation of historical facts if you have so many videos
stirring Holocaust survivors. Why do we have so many ignorance around this topic?
Well, everybody's experience was different, right? So, you know, even when you take, for example, the very difficult comments that we heard over the last few days from one of the ministers in Israel pertaining to Polish anti-Semitism. You know, this comment was first said by former Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, whose father was murdered by Poles, not by Nazi Germans. He was murdered by his Polish neighbors. This is going to lead to a hatred and to a not friendly attitude.
Debate.
Yeah, this happens. And so, you know, there isn't one fixed, clear history. Everybody's experience was different. And as a result of that, it leads to a vary of opinions and understanding connected to these issues.
That's why public debate is so important in this matter. What group do you think were the greatest victims of Second World War?
You know, clearly when we're looking at the victims of the Holocaust, there is no doubt that the Jewish people suffered an incredible amount, and more than other nations. You know, when you look at the Polish Jewish community, you're looking at over 90% of Polish Jews mass murdered by German Nazis. And you're looking at, you know, 3 million additional Jews, not Polish Jews, 6 million plus in total, mass murdered on a, you know, on a really horrific scale. And so when you look at, you know, in terms of victimhood, there isn't much of a question as to who suffered most. You know, rather we need to look at how different nations suffered, because it wasn't just Jews who suffered under German Nazi persecution and horrors. Many other peoples and nations did as well. The Polish nation suffered tremendously under the invasion of Nazi Germany in 1939 through the whole period of the Second World War, with roughly 3 million ethnic Poles murdered.
No matter what religion.
Correct. Well, I mean, when you look at the amount of Poles who were murdered, there was obviously 3 million Polish Jews, but also, you know, what looks like around 3 million ethnic Poles as well. And, you know, these were gypsies and, you know, and
Yep.
homosexuals and many different people, anyone who didn't fit into that specific group. I mean, just yesterday I had a meeting and we were looking at the victims from Auschwitz-Birkenau, and I was surprised to see that there were 4 Chinese prisoners of Auschwitz. You know, so the evil knows no boundaries, and I think this is what we see from that history.
Does it sit in the base of our existence that we need to believe in something superior, something not seen on earth?
Well, look, I mean, that's a very personal question, and a question that everybody looks at differently. I personally believe in God. I personally believe in a greater being, and in a being that determines our future and how we live our lives and how we should live our lives. You know, however, I'm also very much a believer in the fact that people should feel free to live their lives as they want to. My personal opinion on this matter is that as long as you're a good, decent, humane human being, I don't have any issues with whether you believe, how you believe, who you believe in. Every human being, in my opinion, was born and created in the image of God. The only thing that differs between us is situation and circumstance and education.
It is indeed your personal opinion, not really connected to your religion. As I was told that all the Jews believe that every single human being needs to believe in something superior.
Well, there are many different kinds of Jews, as there are many different kinds of Poles and Christians and Muslims, and amongst the Jewish nation there are many different people with different beliefs. I tend to, I consider myself a modern Orthodox Jew. You know, however, I have family members who are Hasidic ultra-Orthodox Jews, as I have family members who are atheist Jews as well.
Politics stands in a clear juxtaposition under the keywords collaboration and competition. On what fields do you think it is particularly important that we collaborate, not compete with one another?
In terms of nations, as Poles?
In terms of states.
In terms of states. Look, I think that this current argument that we're seeing between Poland and Israel is entirely unnecessary. Because at the end of the day, when we really look down at facts, we're all pretty much saying the same thing.
Counterproductive, I would
Completely
say.
counterproductive. And at the end of the day, we're also saying the same thing, right? There's very few people and ignorant people that would put an entire blame of the Holocaust on the Polish nation, which is, at the end of the day, what the IPN bill, this Holocaust bill last year, was attempting to do, was to show and to make a point that the Polish nation was not, culpable for the Second World War, for the Holocaust, for the mass murder of 6 million Jews. However, it was misinterpreted and misunderstood, and it was wrongly placed and wrongly executed, hence the reason for the whole headache. But the truth is, as Poles and Jews, as Poles and Israelis especially, it's not just from a historical perspective that we have a lot in common. We have a lot in common from today's day and age as well, which is, an absolute belief in democracy and an absolute belief in moving forward.
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And, these are things that need to be upheld in both countries. And they're not always upheld in the best ways in both Poland and Israel. Again, I'm liberal in terms of my belief of how people should feel from and be able to express themselves in whichever way they wish, whether it be their religious beliefs, their sexuality, or whatever it may be. But the point is, between Poland and Israel, I think that soon, again, we have elections in both countries coming up very soon, in Israel in just over a couple of weeks, and in Poland soon as well, with the European elections and general elections. But I think that we're going to see a calm in terms of this fighting between both of us, and back to normalization very soon as well.
How should we educate to prevent such a harmful misinterpretation of historical facts?
If you're looking from a Polish perspective, one thing I always say, I have my foundation, I also have a company that deals with public relations, and I work with many different companies and organizations around the world, and one thing I always say is that if you don't tell your story, no one is going to tell it for you. And I think that this, on one hand, was obviously as a result of so many years of oppressive communism here in Poland. Your story was unable to be told. But there isn't an excuse for that now. And Poland really needs to step up and tell their story. Again, as a Jew, I will always be educated first on my history, right? As a Pole, you'll always be educated first on your history, because this is how it works. Now, if you want me and other Jews to understand Polish history, you have to step up and help us understand it. Because, I'm not willingly going to sit down, right, as a teenager, whatever it may be, and start researching someone else's history, because there's a lot of histories and there's a lot to learn. Jewish history is vast, Polish history is vast, but again, we have to work and figure out how we tell our stories to other nations to give them this understanding.
The right communication is valid. Considering the predominance of Jewish influence in the management and ownership, especially in the US, what does it bring the view on global culture, politics, economics, but also including big tech?
Well, I think that that's also a pretty difficult thing to answer. First of all, what's predominance, right? Yes, there is no denying the fact that there are Jews involved in business, and there are many non-Jews involved in business as well.
Scalable.
Again, I think it's nothing. A lot of people watching this will wonder about that question and wonder also how that can be viewed. So I don't feel that there's any kind of, misbalance in terms of Jews in business in the United States and not Jews in business in the United States. The Jewish population of the United States is negligent. It's a tiny community, but a community that works hard and has a strong value system. And I think that, at the end of the day, as we said before, there's not one Jewish voice, right? And this is something that often I'll hear a lot here in Poland and in other countries where they'll say, oh, you Jews, right? And you're always together, and wherever you go around the world, you can always find another Jew, and so on and so forth. It's not as true as you think it is. It truly
is. It a stereotype?
It's an absolute stereotype. It's an absolute stereotype. Again, there are many different kinds of Jews. There are many Jews who completely disagree with what I'm doing here, and who completely
I can see that.
Yeah, and to the point where, to be honest, a lot of my critics, probably maybe even more of my critics, would be Jewish as opposed to Polish, right? Because they'll disagree with my perceived relationships with people here in Poland or whatever it may be. So within the Jewish community, there is vast differences in opinion. The same way that I said before, you have religious Jews and completely secular Jews. You have Zionist Jews who support the state of Israel.
That's right.
And you have Jews who do not support the state of Israel, which may surprise you as well.
It leads us perfectly to my next question, which is, would you draw a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
No. I think that there are very few cases, a criticism of the state of Israel is legitimate in certain cases. Israel, like any nation, does things that people may agree with or disagree with, and that's fair enough and okay. The problem that we see today is a lot of the anti-Zionistic opinions tend to just come straight from the anti-Semitic playbook. And even when you look, for example, at the United Nations and the amount of condemnations that they have towards Israel and the supposed mistreatment of the Palestinians or whoever they may be, this is completely out of sway in terms of actual problems around the world, right? When you look at the absolute horrors of the mass murders in Syria, the mass murders of Christians in the Middle East by their Arab neighbors, this isn't even comparable or barely spoken about, as opposed to the occasional arguments and fights that we have in the Middle East. Israel's in a very difficult neighborhood, right? You have a tiny country completely surrounded by neighbors who don't want you there, by far and large, right? By neighbors who, as they've said in the past, would like to push us into the sea. And so when you're dealing with these issues, Israel, of course, has to be tough and has to stand for themselves. Because if we don't, we're not going to survive.
So is it just all a political battle, in your opinion?
No, politics is at play at some point, but there's also more to it. There's religion plays part as well, which is, in my opinion, a completely incorrect way to look at any religion, is to look at religion in a way of poor values and so on and so forth. But politics is the crux of most issues and most problems around the world, as we see.
Correct. Well, thank you for finding time in such an eventful week, and it's a very valid lesson for all of us.
Thank you very much.
For coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, John.